Hi, I'm Bryce Crittenden.
Hi, I'm Caroline Lant, and welcome back to EPL's Overdue Finds.
Caroline, are you excited as I am for today's episode?
I am so pumped. I have been ready all day. We're doing an afternoon recording, pulling back the curtain so people can get into our headspace. Afternoon recording, and I have been just ready to go all day.
Nice. This is an episode. It's become like one of my favorite episodes that we do all year. I say that for a few episodes. It's like this one and our best of the year episodes are definitely two of the episodes I love doing the most. It's the most fun to put together. Probably with this episode today, there's going to be some controversy around it. And, this is something that EPL staff are passionate about. The public has become passionate about it over the last few years. And of course, that is our annual March Madness tournament. Caroline, unfortunately, we still don't have that air horn yet that we kind of need, but
Yeah.
we're working on it.
I probably should have brought this up with you before today, but what's the status of our air horn? Do you know?
Well, it's tough right now because, as we mentioned in the podcast, I'm still recording at home. Right. I don't remember the last time I recorded an episode that wasn't from my kitchen room, dining room table. But when we do move it back into the studio at Milner, there is a soundboard. So maybe for next year's March Madness, we'll have an annoying sound like air horn to play.
And I think by annoying, you might mean awesome.
Yeah, definitely that for sure.
So that's something to look forward to for our 5th annual March Madness tournament. But this year, we're excited to be doing number 4.
Yeah, as you probably saw by the episode description, this year's theme, best of the 90s. And, previous years, the first year we started off with best movie based on a book. And then we did the best of the 2010s. And then last year was best character, which surprisingly had Moana as the winner, which nothing against Moana, but
she was definitely a surprise choice.
Yeah. And this one is similar to the 2010s one, of course, best of the 90s. And we kind of, here at EPL, we always love to get staff input on a lot of the episodes we do, especially our March Madness tournament. And Caroline, I think you counted how many picks did we go through? It was over, is that 350?
It was over 350 different titles that we reviewed and applied a few things to it, is it available in our catalog? Because as much as we want to celebrate the 90s as a decade, we also want to promote our collection. So it was important that we had something in there, as well as some debates on, is it going to be this book or that book if they had the same author or something like that. So yeah,
it was hard. And today, of course, as with all of our previous preview episodes, we are going over this year's tournament bracket. We're going to be sharing our picks, but most importantly, we've got 2 EPL staff members here to help us kind of go through the tournament. They're going to give our picks, or they're going to give their picks, I should say. And I think, like with all past ones, I'm really interested to see what everybody has winning, because I don't think any of us have ever had the same pick on any of these preview episodes in the past. So this is going to be entertaining.
I remember so clearly. So longtime listeners of the show may remember that the very first March Madness preview episode was my first episode as co-host. And I remember going into the record going, what are we going to talk about? Because clearly we've all chosen the same things. And I get there and I look at everyone else's bracket and no one's looked like mine and no one's looked like each other's. So I don't know. I always have that feeling of going into this. Are we not just going to have the same things? But we probably won't, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. And we got 2 guests joining us today. First of all, I want to welcome back to the show. She is a member of the Overdue Finds family, editor extraordinaire, frequent guest, Meg DeForest. Welcome back. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I agree with Caroline, highlight of the podcasting year, this
Yeah.
episode. So yeah, really excited.
Yeah, lots of work behind the scenes too, just from our shout out to Caitlin and Alexis on our communications team who handles the social media too, because that also plays a big part of this, and lots of work going on behind the scenes right now at EPL. And I think everybody's going to have fun with it. But and also joining us today, Caroline, I think this might be a record, maybe well, probably not since, when we first started the podcast, but we have another not a new staff member, but an EPLer making their very first appearance today on Overdue Finds. She is a librarian at our Calder branch. Christy Travis, welcome to Overdue Finds. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this episode. I could talk about the 90s forever, so I'm really interested to see what you guys have picked.
Yeah, it's funny because as I mentioned a little while ago, like we reached out to staff and through our internal thing here at EPL called Staff Web, and people were giving their submissions, and you were definitely one of the EPLers who had the most opinions. Anyway, you're like, guys, we need to include this, and this. So yeah, and so I'm going to be curious. We're going to get to a part where we talk about omissions and everything, and I have a feeling and I know Meg is definitely going to be upset that we didn't include a couple titles, but we'll hear about that a little bit later. But Christy, of course, you're at the Calder branch, and of course, nobody can see right now, but you are sitting in front of the beautiful, I think it's a mosaic, isn't it? Kind of right behind you. There's lots of highlights at the Calder branch, but that's definitely one of the main ones, isn't it?
Yes, so the mosaic was actually created by community members. So the community members made the tiles, and then we had a couple of artists do the design on the wall. And yes, it's very pretty. You can see it from the road when you drive by the branch. It's really nice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and hey, if you want to go in and get a great Instagram shot, perfect place
Totally.
for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. So before we start talking about our March Madness picks and we debate all things the 90s, let's share our recent Overdue Finds picks. Meg, it's been a while since you've been on. I think your last episode was our sci-fi books one, so it's been a little while. But do you have another sci-fi book recommendation for us this week?
I don't. I'm going to break out of my usual picks. This week, my pick is No Reservations with Anthony Bourdain. We do have a DVD, one of the seasons at EPL. And I think, like a lot of people, I'm missing that travel and food from other places kind of experience. And so it's a lot of fun to sort of watch. I think especially watching Bourdain because he kind of goes and meets locals. And like usually the best part of the episode is he just like finds somebody's mom who's like willing to cook for him and their house. And so it's not even just like restaurant food. It's just kind of like what do the locals eat, but it also kind of has a bit of that culture. And one of the episodes I watched was looking at like macaw, I think that's how you say it, food, and sort of like the Portuguese influence on sort of mainland Chinese food, and how that's kind of all mixed together. So I think that's kind of a really cool way to maybe get in that travel bug, and also go a little bit deeper than maybe just the tourist view of seeing the highlights of a place. You get to see like what's good home cooking look like here. So definitely recommend No Reservations. We do also have the book, so that's a good read.
Yeah, he's not eating at like the Hard Rock Cafe when he goes to these places. Like he's going like truly authentic to the area or the region that he's in. Yeah, that's a show I've maybe seen like a handful of episodes here and there over the years, but definitely something I've been watching a lot more Food Network since I've been cooking from home during the pandemic. So that's definitely a show I want to go back and watch some more. Have you, because I think it just came out on DVD, have you seen Roadrunner? It's a documentary about Anthony Bourdain yet?
No, I definitely have it on my list, though. I think he's a really interesting figure, and obviously, sadly, not with us anymore. But yeah, he was sort of one of those interesting people who looked at food from that different lens, which I think is really important. Not just sort of saying like, what's the Chinese food that you can get from your, maybe rural 1980s chicken balls in Canada perspective, but like, what does the authentic food taste like? And I think that's really a cool way to travel.
Yeah, absolutely. Christy, first time on the show. What's a title that you can recommend for listeners?
So I just finished reading a book called The Push by Ashley Audrain, I think it is. So for anybody who's ever read the book or seen the movie We Need to Talk About Kevin, that came out quite a few years ago, it has a similar vibe. Just a quick summary. So it's about a young mother who, has a bit of a history of mental illness. Growing up, she didn't have a lot of great motherly figures in her life. So she now has a daughter of her own, and she's starting to notice some concerning behavioral traits, I guess, in her child. And because of her history, she's not sure if it's all in her head. The people around her are telling her it's all in her head, but she sees these things. So, it's a bit of a psychological thriller. It's a bit of a mystery. And it's just one of those books that I stayed up way too late trying to finish because I couldn't put it down.
Yeah, I've read The Push, and it's a total page turner.
Yeah. And a little bit disturbing in parts, especially if you're a parent, but it's very well written. It's very good.
You mentioned We Need to Talk About Kevin. That movie still to this day, like if I'm making a list of the most disturbing movies of all time, I unfortunately haven't had a chance to read the book, but I think the movie was enough for me to watch. And it's just one of those movies, when you watch it, like you will never forget it.
Yeah, the book has stayed with me to this day. So, yeah.
Caroline, how about you? I know we are getting, when we're recording this, we're in the final days of the Olympics.
We are.
I'm not sure how much media or books you've been able to consume since our last recording, because I know you're very heavily invested in the Olympics.
I am.
Do you have any picks for us this week?
Yeah, I do. When not watching the skating events at the Olympics, I have been very deep into March Madness preparations, and so I kind of like have my thing. So I was worried about spoilers, but I think if you're listening to this, it's out in the world. The bracket has been released, so you will have seen Katie Lang not on March Madness. That was one, specifically Ingenue, when I was looking at the titles that stuck out to me, and immediately, Constant Craving started playing in my head. So we have it available on Hoopla, went and downloaded it, listening to early 90s Katie Lang. It's kind of the vibe that I'm in right now.
Yeah, I feel mostly responsible for Katie Lang not being on that list, actually. So we'll maybe touch on that a little bit later on. But yeah.
Yeah. So if anyone else wants to relive that era of your life, Hoopla has a number of Katie Lang, actually. So, yeah. Bryce, what about you? What have you been enjoying?
Well, just like you, Caroline, a lot of March Madness prep going on. Like, had like the boards up in my house and diagrams and post-it notes and drawing arrows to stuff, and it was really hard. But there was a title that was recommended that maybe we include, and normally I would have maybe gave it a pass to put on here, but it premiered in 1999, but to me it was more of a show that really kind of defined probably the early 2000s, so I kind of really didn't feel like it wasn't really giving me best of 90s vibes, and that is The Sopranos. So a few episodes ago, I recommended the prequel movie, The Many Saints of Newark. And I mentioned I was a big Sopranos fan. And since I watched that movie, I've actually now been going back and revisiting the series from the very beginning. And I guess if you've never had a chance to watch it, or maybe you haven't really watched it since it's been since it ended, we have all 6 seasons on DVD that you can borrow from us here at EPL, and I cannot recommend it enough. For those of you who might not be as familiar with the show, Of course, it follows the life of New Jersey mobster Tony Soprano, who's played brilliantly by the late James Gandolfini. Of course, we follow him as he deals with his job as a New Jersey mob boss who works in air quotes sanitation, and his immediate family. Mental health actually is a really big topic in this show, especially kind of the early seasons. And some of the episodes, of course, are very hard to watch just due to the violence and some other nature of obviously illegal activities that are taking place on the show. But this is one, like I said, if you're looking for something new to watch, or if you're like me and you kind of have like just those comfort shows you enjoy watching over and over again, I've got a few like this, and The Sopranos is definitely one of those shows that I can always kind of go back to, and I'm really enjoying my rewatch. And if you're looking for something new or need another rewatch, go check out The Sopranos. All right, so let's get to why we're here today. Of course, for the entire month of March, you can go to our website, epl.ca/podcast, Facebook, Twitter, and our Instagram pages, and vote on your choice to determine the ultimate best of the 90s. Obviously, this tournament, we are inspired by the NCAA basketball tournament. So, this tournament, really, we're setting out to decide just what book, movie, TV show, or musical artist is all that and a bag of chips. You can download your bracket, as I mentioned, at epl.ca/podcast. And of course, share it on social media by using the hashtag EPL March Madness. So before we start talking about our picks, let's chat briefly about kind of the brainstorming phase. Christy, what comes to mind when you think of the 90s?
Oh, that's a question. So I was a teenager for the majority of the 90s. So a lot of it is very nostalgic stuff for me. So the fashion. So I know the listeners can't see me, but I wore a red plaid shirt in honor of the episode today because it was all about the plaid shirt, the baggy pants. Yeah. The music for me is something that's very important to me. The grunge music. One of the things I loved was all the CDs that Much Music used to put out, like Big Shiny Tunes, Dance Mix. I had Dance Mix 95 playing all the time. But even just the start of the internet as well. So I remember my parents getting our first PC with Windows 95, the dial-up internet, waiting for it to connect. That sound will always remind me of the 90s. And then, of course, playing Solitaire and Minesweeper was the best thing ever.
Has anybody ever figured out really how to properly play Minesweeper, by the way? Just click and hope you don't.
Oh, yeah. When you get the numbers, you're just like, oh, and then you put the question marks on it. Oh, I get very serious about Minesweeper.
There's an app for that now, Caroline. If you really need your Minesweeper fix, you can do it on your phone.
Meg, when you heard that we were going to be doing a best of the 90s, what for you really when you were kind of brainstorming titles with us, what do the 90s, I guess, mean to you?
Similar to Christy, that's a real nostalgic time for me, but also I really think, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, for me, 90s is really peak movie soundtrack time, where 10 Things I Hate About You, Can't Hardly Wait, so many of those were because, for our younger listeners, this was before streaming of music. And so one of the really great ways that you got into new bands was you would get these soundtrack CDs, and you could sort of figure out who you liked based on sort of the aesthetic of the film. And so for me, that's a really big part of the 90s, is that sort of pre-streaming mindset, and also even just pre-streaming for TV shows. I think it's so funny that now we're going back to weekly releases, so many things on Netflix or Amazon Prime. They're we're going to put it out one a week, and it's this new model, and everyone's like, wow, what innovation. I'm like, they just reinvented cable TV, guys. So it is sort of funny how that came back around again, when people are like, oh, actually it is nice to just watch one episode and then wait a week and be really excited and talk to your friends about what's going to happen next time. So yeah, I definitely think that that's it. And also I think there was a lot more I don't know about adult cartoons, but like Daria, like there were just like more kind of interesting cartoon animation things kind of happening. I feel like, at least that's when I was really getting into at that point. And so I think that's kind of something that was really starting in the 90s. And we were getting a lot more of like Sailor Moon or Power Rangers, or sort of a more international kind of kids TV too was happening. So a lot of really cool influences, I think, in the 90s.
Yeah, I was just going to say with the animation, especially too in the 90s, we were starting to get a little bit more darker and edgier. Like our last episode, my Overdue Fine pick was Batman the Animated Series, and which came out in the 90s. And, you mentioned Daria. Of course, Daria, a lot of people forget, is a spin-off from Beavis and Butthead, which was also huge in, I remember in grade 12 going with my friends to opening night of Beavis and Butthead Do America. And like people were cheering, like we're so excited to see Beavis and Butthead on the big screen. So just a wild time. Caroline, how about for you though? Like, for the 90s?
Christy, Meg, you both mentioned music. Music was by far the most not mentioned topic when we looked at the suggestions that staff had given us. Music, I mean, for lack of a better word, music struck a chord with people, and like people were listing off, a dozen, 15 bands that were their like top 10 on it, and it was probably the area that people got most passionate about, watching the suggestions come in on that. I definitely think of music too from the 90s. I think of boy bands and girl groups. It's the era of like the soaring ballad, Celine Dion, Shania Twain, such sweepingness. I think we talked about that in the soundtrack episode as well. And then when I was thinking about movies, I was thinking about how the small, this is what I wrote down, the small went big and the big went bigger, because you had indie films really breaking through, something like Pulp Fiction or The English Patient, which on paper shouldn't have been a cultural touchstone, but it became this like big thing that it became a plot point on Seinfeld. But the movies that were already big just got even bigger with the blockbusters, the summer July 4th opening weekend stuff. So there was this grand scale to the 90s of just like everything, I think, getting bigger and bigger, culminating in something like Titanic, which, was just everything at the time. So yeah. Bryce, what about your 90s? What does it look like?
Yeah, like similar to what Christy said. I mean, I was a teenager for most of the 90s. So a lot of nostalgia for me, and just being in high school and junior high during this period. Just like everybody else, actually, I've got the same answer. Really, like the music for me, like was the biggest thing that really stood out. A lot of the kind of titles we come across, like for the books or the movies or TV shows, were fairly easy for me, I guess, to kind of help narrow down. But definitely the music was the most challenging, and I think mostly because we saw such a huge shift in music in the 90s. And like you mentioned kind of the boy bands and everything, and Christy, you're wearing some plaid today, but like really the biggest thing, like we saw like grunge, obviously, and that just whole movement, like kind of, we went from, it was like one day it was like Poison and Whitesnake, and the next day it's Nirvana and Pearl Jam, and just totally two different rock genres, and people started dressing differently. So yeah, it was music for me definitely was kind of the biggest thing, I think, during this period.
So looking at the bracket, we had, like I say, 350 plus suggestions, plus more as we got actually working our way down. We kept inadvertently adding some to the list.
Yeah, I kept getting these email pings. It's like, bing.
Yeah.
I'll just be working. It'll be like Barbie Girl by Aqua. I'm like, no.
from that, as I mentioned, 64 titles on the list, 16 in each bracket. Was there a certain title or artist that you're upset didn't make the tournament? Meg, let's start with you.
So yeah, as Bryce mentioned, I have sort of two main ones that I am very upset about. Mainly Empire Records. It's one of my favorite movies of almost all time. It's definitely that classic, like, teens working in a record store, so we have the excuse to play good music, and they sort of filmed it as if it was summer camp, like they all just spent a summer filming it together, and so they just sort of feel like friends, and it's definitely kind of a great movie for all those reasons that I was mentioning earlier, but kind of, I think, also really different from the 80s teen movies. Like, I think we start to see that shift from, like, Breakfast Club and Pretty in Pink and then sort of into Empire Records and things like that sort of changed what sort of teen movies were and what you could talk about in teen movies. And so, yeah, that's definitely one of my favorites. And then the other one that I'm very shocked that Bryce did not make on here is, of course, wrestling. Wrestling was huge in the 90s, and I even messaged him to be like, why is Raw not on this? We have it in our collection. Like, I was not into wrestling very much at the time, but even I knew who, like, the big stars were, and, like, kids would show up in my very suburban school showing, like, with, like, Austin 316 t-shirts, and it was, I just like today it's not a part of our culture the way that it really was in the 80s and 90s, where, like, just random people on the street would really know what was going on in wrestling. And I mean, I guess now there's The Rock and he sort of came out of that, but people don't necessarily know what's going on in wrestling the same way today as they would have in the 90s, for sure.
Bryce, do you want to answer to that?
Yeah, I can. So it's funny because, like, I not that I forgot about Raw, but, like, when you mentioned it, I was like, yeah, like, absolutely. Like, if you're a little bit younger and you weren't, maybe, you don't really remember the TV landscape in the late 90s, but, like, Monday Night Raw was, like, the show to be watching. Like, you could not miss an episode. Like, somebody was going to show up that you didn't expect. Like, it was the ultimate. There's a reason why they call it like the ultimate male soap opera. But yeah, we had huge stars come out of it. Like you said, The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, like, everybody. And yeah, it's funny because, like, on my personal list, it had kind of made the top 10. And just when we were kind of, Caroline and I were going through and finalizing stuff, and I was just like, oh man, like, I wanted to include it, and I was like, no, if I include it, then people are gonna be like, oh, this is just Bryce making his pick. And I knew Meg would have my back on this one, but
I do have your back.
Yeah. What about you, Christy? What's missing?
So I had two main ones as well. Going back to the music. So for me in the 90s, I listened to a lot of Lilith Fair type music. So Sarah McLachlan, Tori Amos, Chantal Kraviatzik. So, maybe they're not quite as mainstream as what's included in the final picks, but to me that was a big part of my 90s music listening experience. So I was a little bit bummed that it wasn't included. But because I do think, like, for girl power kind of thing in the pop world, we had Spice Girls, but in the rock alternative world, it was more like Lilith Fair, Sarah McLachlan, things like that. Alanis Morissette, I think, maybe is on there, so that's a good representation. And then in terms of TV shows, and I think this is similar to The Sopranos, maybe, in that most of this TV show was probably more early 2000s, but it did start in the late 90s, is Dawson's Creek. After Beverly Hills 90210, that was kind of the next teen drama that came out after that. And you were either Team Dawson, Team Pacey. It was a huge part of my late teen years. So
yeah,
it not being on there kind of hurt a little, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, Christy, I'm just going to correct you slightly on there. You were either Team Pacey or wrong.
Oh, exactly. No, I agree.
I mean, come on.
I have to, be inclusive here, though. So.
Yeah, if any listeners out there, if you were Team Dawson, let us know. I want to hear from you.
I want to know what Team Bryce is on, because I think that's really important to our listeners.
I can honestly say I've never watched a single episode. I know that's shocking.
Fair.
Person who at the time was watching Monday Night Raw was not watching Dawson's Creek.
Yeah, it was that was hard for me as well because it does kind of straddle the late 90s, early 2000s, which became an interesting point on this because unlike past years where we had, I think, harder and firmer criteria, we were kind of fast and loose this year around how things were feeling. We went sometimes by just vibe. And if it felt like the 90s, we included it. And if it felt other, we didn't so much.
I just want to mention one movie that I'm a little surprised, and I kind of wish maybe I would have maybe took more of a stand with it, is Toy Story. Yeah, because if you look at the release of Toy Story, I believe it came out in 95.
Yeah.
And such a huge movie for Disney, because up until that point, of course, we're getting, of course, all the hand-drawn animation stuff, and you see Lion King and Aladdin in the tournament, and they should absolutely be there. But I don't think we can kind of discount the fact that, if it wasn't for Toy Story being such a huge hit, we might not have, well, I'm pretty sure we would now, but we might not have as many computer animated films like we do. And I think a lot of people were maybe questioning it, how good is this movie kind of essentially made by computers going to be? But, this Toy Story was the original computer animated movie, and, it laid the groundwork for pretty much all the animated movies we see now today.
Yeah. For me, I think one that I was surprised by, but I'm okay with, was My So-Called Life not making it in the TV category. And partly because, all of the shows exist in a particular era, with the possible exception of The Simpsons, which it has no endpoint yet to it. But My So-Called Life just is that mid 90s period. I didn't fight too hard to have it on there, but when I think of 90s TV, that's the kind of thing I think of.
We take a look at the first round matchups. There's some really tough ones in there. Meg, for you, what was the toughest first round matchup for you to try and decide between?
Yeah, there was a couple. I really felt like Terminator versus Matrix was really tough, because I feel like sometimes we have weird juxtapositions of children's things versus adult, and they're so different that you're just whatever, it's going to be whoever finds it. I do feel like those had some real similar overlap of audience, so I do think that's going to break a few hearts. And I was how did Terminator 2 not make it past the first round? It's well, it drew the Matrix. It's not, because Terminator 2 is not better than some of the other movies in my opinion, but it just sort of luck of the draw. That's kind of what happened. And sort of talking about the Simpsons versus Degrassi was really rough too, because I think when I think of today's Simpsons, it's really terrible, and I love Degrassi way more than that, but 90s Simpsons was really peak Simpsons. So that's also do you look at the whole Simpsons, or are you just looking at that really 90s Simpsons? So I think that'll be an interesting, when we sort of get people voting on it, it'll be kind of interesting. How do people think of something like that sort of is still going on, and maybe people have more modern feelings about than really that peak time. So
yeah, Caroline made a really good point. When Caroline and I were finalizing kind of all the picks, it was kind of funny because Simpsons of course comes up, and we're oh, where does it rank? And Caroline made a really good point. She said you know what, if Simpsons ran from let's say 1989 when it debuted to 2001 or 2002, the series ends, it's by far our number one ranked show. It goes down, and it still will go down, I think, as one of the greatest shows of all time. But it's also as a huge Simpsons fan myself, I also recognize it probably should have ended a little while ago.
Terminator 2, Bryce, do you want to reveal how close that movie came to not making it on the tournament?
Yeah, I was the only person to pick Terminator 2, and I will admit, when we're making these, I'm look at everybody's picks and try and make sure kind of the most popular ones are included. And this is we've jokingly in the past have referred to the Rick and Morty card, where like myself or Caroline will have one pick that nobody else has, but we're like, look, this thing has to be included in here. And for me, it was Terminator 2. Terminator 2 was, I said to you, Caroline, this is the very first R-rated movie I ever went and saw in the theater. I was 11 years old. I had to lie and say I was 14. And when I say I was like 11, I probably looked like I was like 9 or 8. So I don't know how they believed I was 14 and they let me see that movie. But similar to you, Meg, just with, the tough matchups here in the first round, Matrix and Terminator 2. And as groundbreaking as the Matrix is, Terminator 2 also, maybe for those of us who weren't kind of at a particular age in 1991 when it first came out, was just as groundbreaking. And you look at, if you go back and watch that movie, those special effects, similar to Jurassic Park in a way, they still hold up. They look better than some action movies do today. And this is also kind of the rare instance where a sequel is way better than the original. I think everybody that summer was saying "Hasta la vista, baby." Like, it was such a huge movie to come out of the 90s, and I was like, I don't think we're doing this justice if we don't include it.
Christy, how about you?
So mine was actually in the second round. It came down between Babysitter's Club and Harry Potter, which was the most agonizing decision of my life. Those were two very, very important series to me. However, I do realize that Harry Potter was I did read Harry Potter a bit later, so I was older when I read Harry Potter. But still, just when it came down to those two, I was like, I don't know how to choose this. Like, I just don't know. The other one for me in the first round was Home Alone and Aladdin, I think, were paired up together. And that was also very difficult because I love both of those movies. I've seen them both, I don't know how many times. So I just struggled with that one so much.
Yeah. The Babysitter's Club was an interesting one because it also started in the 80s and had published, I think, roughly 30 books before the 90s started. So I said to Bryce, okay, we're just going to look at Marianne and the Great Romance to The Fire at Marianne's House. Like, that's all we're going to cover.
I, of course, knew immediately what she was talking about, by the way.
It makes sense.
But that was in the first, and this was one of my answers on this one for like the hardest was the Babysitter's Club versus Mouse, because what are you even looking at, right? Like, what? So I mean, that's why I love March Madness.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Tupac and Celine Dion. Like, what are you even comparing? And like, yes, they're technically both music, but
yeah,
I don't know.
My the one that I sat here going, don't make me choose. The hardest one for me was the matchup between Shania and Alanis. And yes, I am on a first name basis with these artists because you just need one name. Shania, Alanis, the 90s. This is the thing. So Jagged Little Pill, huge monster smash, iconic. The thing people don't realize, Come On Over by Shania Twain is one of the top 20 selling CDs of all time. It was huge. And like it had like a dozen singles off of it. That was really tough. My other one was right below it with Whitney versus Barenaked Ladies. Barenaked Ladies, I have to say, would probably have been my Rick and Morty card. I don't think it came down to it exactly, but I was ready to say, like, no, you're not taking them off. Gordon and Stunt are two masterful albums, but so is the Bodyguard soundtrack. So I really, really struggled with like the bottom half of the music bracket.
Speaking of the Bodyguard soundtrack, we've talked a lot about music here, but it just kind of goes to show like really how important it was in this decade. But there's certain albums that I have a theory that absolutely everybody in the 90s in your household, if you didn't have it, maybe your sister did or your dad did or somebody had like a cassette of it in the car. It was Jagged Little Pill and the Bodyguard soundtrack. everybody had at least one, if not both, of those albums at some point.
So lots of heartbreak, like right off the bat too. When I was filling mine out, because I love polls, right? Like I love choosing stuff. That's why I get so excited in March. But I would just like I started in the top quadrant with books and went until I got stuck. By which I mean I'm like, oh, I like both of these. Then I would jump to the next one until I got stuck there and would just keep going until I had to force myself to continue. So, as with any March Madness tournament, there are going to be some upsets where some of those higher ranked items get knocked out in an early round. Which ones could you see that happening to? Christy, let's start.
Well, this was kind of a hard one. I think sometimes my tastes are quite different from like the mainstream. Whenever I think about typical 90s pop culture lists in terms of TV shows, usually at the top, Friends and Seinfeld are always in the top five. But I wouldn't put them in my top five. I love Friends. I'm actually not a Seinfeld fan. That's probably an unpopular opinion, but yeah, controversy. But I don't know. I feel like maybe there's a lot of diversity in our customers' picks, so that might be a surprise if they have as if they're as passionate about some of these things as we are, that might be different from the mainstream. We could see those maybe not make it to the final round.
Christy, I totally agree. I have Seinfeld as my answer for this. On my bracket, I have it losing to Boy Meets World in round 2. I honestly could see it getting knocked out by Pride and Prejudice. I mean, we are a library fan base. You know, a lot of the people taking part in this March Madness might be partial to the BBC miniseries Pride and Prejudice. I could see that happening.
That was my pick actually for the first round upset. It's funny because we were making the matchups. I was like almost like, no, let's change Seinfeld's like rankings so it's not matched up against Pride and Prejudice in the first round. It's going to get knocked out. I really think like I'm a huge Seinfeld fan, and that this is similar to Sopranos or The Simpsons. This for me is a total comfort show. Like I watch an episode, at least one every single night. Like, and I'm not exaggerating either. Like I've seen them all. I love it. It's hands down like easily one of my all-time favorite comedies. But just knowing kind of, Krista, as you said, like just kind of the diverse taste of a lot of our, EPL's card holders and just the general public. Like, I'm a huge Seinfeld fan, but I know not everybody else is. So yeah, and just with it being us being a library, I could see Pride and Prejudice knocking it off, but I'm team Seinfeld.
With Seinfeld, I'm just going to take a chance to say that it and The Simpsons were our biggest rule breakers, in which the library doesn't carry the series itself, but carries a number of peripheral items, including the soundtrack to Seinfeld, which I am intrigued by and will be downloading from Hoopla soon. So that I'll be talking about that, I'm sure, on an upcoming episode of the podcast.
The fact that I could just drive around listening to the Seinfeld theme music is amazing to me.
Okay, so we're all in on Seinfeld. Meg, are you going to make it 4 for 4?
I'm not. I'm breaking the mold here. My top pick was Titanic. I feel like it is very 90s, but like I couldn't see it beating Home Alone. Like it was just one of those things where I feel like it is very 90s, but in some ways it's also kind of cringe. Like if you sort of think of like, it was so influential, and this sometimes happens with The Simpsons, that like the clips from it are now reused in so many things that I think people are kind of tired of it. Like, I'm the king of the world, or like, draw me like your French ladies. Like, I think those have become such memes outside of the movie that I sort of feel like it might not have the nostalgia of Home Alone and sort of the support the way that maybe some of the other early high ranking items might. And maybe everyone's going to be like super fans of Leo. I don't know. But if they're super fans of Leo, they also still have Romeo and Juliet. So I feel like they're probably going to go that way over Titanic is my guess.
I just want to say one other one too that I noticed that I think could surprise people, and that's just based on the rankings right now. In the books category, Bridget Jones' Diary is like ranked second, and it's up against 15th ranked Outlander. Now, Outlander, of course, I have a feeling Outlander could be Bridget Jones' Diary. And just, I think obviously the TV show, the popularity of it will play a huge role in that. But from everything that I've never read obviously either book, big shock. But I do know the impact that Bridget Jones' Diary had when it was released originally. And I think it had more of an impact in the 90s than definitely the first Outlander book did. And I believe it caught on a little bit later. So that's one where I could see an upset happening. Let's find out who everyone had in their final four and who you had winning. Christy, what does your final four look like?
Okay, so for books, I had The Babysitter's Club, which maybe not be a surprise since I talked about that earlier. Yeah, I mean, it was like the first fandom I was ever a part of. And the reason I think it should win the book category anyway is because I think it's still going strong today. Like, they're graphic novels, the kids are still reading them. I'm still reading them. My parents actually kept all of my Babysitter's Club books and just shipped them out to me, and I reread some of them recently. Like, the Netflix series was great, so I think it still has a huge influence and staying power today. So that's kind of why I picked that. In terms of TV shows, The Simpsons. I think it's hard to argue with the longest running TV show. I think it is the longest running TV show now, right? Yeah, it finally broke the record. As Meg said, I looked at it as 90's Simpsons because I think I wouldn't have voted for it as a whole. But definitely it was a huge part of my 90's TV viewing. So I had to vote for it. Movies, I ended up picking Aladdin. It came down between Aladdin and Jurassic Park for me. Very tough decision because, again, like, I love both of those movies and I've seen them both so many times. But I decided to go for the more lighthearted option, I guess. It's a movie I can watch with my kids. It won't scare them like Jurassic Park might. So, and if I think about, I just thought Robin Williams' performance was just so great in Aladdin. And Robin Williams didn't have a lot of representation in this bracket, so I kind of wanted to vote for it in that sense as well. And then music, I actually ended up voting for Barenaked Ladies. It came down between Backstreet Boys and Barenaked Ladies, two very different types of boy bands. My sister was a huge Backstreet Boys fan. So I absorbed a lot of it through her. But for me, I think the Barenaked Ladies is just so symbolic of Canadian 90's music. As Caroline mentioned, like the Gordon and the Stunt albums were just phenomenal albums. When Stephen Page left the band, like, it physically hurt me. So I just have a lot of fond memories of me and my friends listening to them. So that was my music pick.
Yeah. So what was your final?
So it ended up being The Simpsons. I think in terms of all of those, The Simpsons is probably the thing that I quote the most in my everyday life. We still sit and watch The Simpsons from the 90's. And I just think it has such an influence on pop culture today that it made sense for it to be the pick for me.
Yeah. If you look at the early 90's, like, they released an album, like Do the Bartman. That was huge in like 1990. So yeah, it was just absolutely huge. So yeah, I will not argue with your winning pick there. Meg, how about you? What did your final four look like?
Yeah, so a little similar, but mostly different. I also had Babysitter's Club winning the books. I think that's probably, it's just got such generational staying power. I could see that having a really big draw. But for me in TV, Fresh Prince won. I just think that it's got that really great mix of the 90's, like kind of the opposite of Titanic with the cringe. It has that real heartfelt, like, I still almost cry every time I see that clip of Uncle Phil and like, why doesn't he want me? Like, it just had like that family heart thing to it that I think in the 90s wasn't mocked so much. Like, you could have that sort of real feeling. And so I think that there's a real nostalgia for that. And then, so that's kind of how it beat out a bunch of things to me, because I was sort of like, okay, well, maybe I personally liked Buffy the Vampire Slayer better as a TV show then, but when I think of like what long-term kind of had that impact, I really feel like Fresh Prince kind of was a great one. And then for me, Matrix was the movie winner. Again, just I feel like I'll have to fight Bryce on this, I guess, but I think that it was really just kind of out there, and it was something really different. And yeah, and then for music, I had Nirvana. Again, it's just so quintessentially 90s that I just kept being like, I love Barenaked Ladies or I love Alanis, but it was like I couldn't not go with Nirvana just as being like the sound of the 90s. But in the end, I had Fresh Prince versus Matrix, which then I realized both have reboots coming out right now. So that was also something that I sort of realized once I got to my final two, is that Showcase has a new darker Fresh Prince coming out, and of course the new Matrix movie. And so I also thought, well, maybe that was in the back of my head, that thinking about like what 90s nostalgia and like what are their fan bases still for. So Matrix ended up taking it for me.
Nice. So far we've got The Simpsons, we've got The Matrix. Caroline, what did you pick?
I have my final four: Jurassic Park showing up for the books, which I was kind of surprised by. Another one of these things where I'm filling it out and it's like, oh, I guess you just keep winning. But that whole like Michael Crichton airport blockbuster of that you would see everywhere, I was okay with that representing for the books. I had Lion King in movies. I had Backstreet Boys in music and The Simpsons for TV. And my final was The Simpsons versus Backstreet Boys, with The Simpsons taking it.
Whoa, Simpsons.
Yep.
I like it.
Yeah.
So mine's going to surprise some people here, but on the book side, I actually had Harry Potter coming through on that one. For me, I was kind of looking at like, we got it seemed like a whole new generation of kids, reading again and everything. So yeah, that's how I've never read it myself, but that's where I was kind of going with it. I knew kind of thinking about the impact it had.
Well, I'm thinking with your marketing background, I'm sure that you were thinking of how Harry Potter movie 7 part 2 took the best of the 2010s.
It did. Yeah.
So it's got some power for sure.
That's right. Believe it or not, on the TV side, I have Seinfeld going through as the winner. Most people who know me know I'm a huge Simpsons fan. For me, it was really tough because I actually ended up Simpsons versus Seinfeld ended up being in the third round for me. And I went with Seinfeld just because of, I thought about, there's pictures you can see online where in 1998, when they aired the finale of Seinfeld, it was being shown in Times Square on the giant screen. People were gathered there watching it. People, of course, had the watch parties and everything. So I believe the finale to this day is still one of the most watched TV shows of all time. So just that impact for me kind of made it go through. Over on the movies side, for me, it was Jurassic Park. I think that movie just kind of really summed up everything 90s summer blockbusters. Yeah, because it seemed like after that, it was like Jurassic Park was that big, huge movie in 93. And then after that, we get our Independence Days and our Men in Blacks and all of this other stuff. So it really kind of helped rejuvenate the summer blockbuster. And over in music, for me, it was Nirvana, of course, just kind of making it through. As I mentioned at the top of the show, you can't deny the impact that it had as far as the whole grunge scene, and it really kind of kicked to the curb like Motley Crue and Whitesnake and all those hair metal bands. In the final, I had Seinfeld up against Nirvana, and my winner being Nirvana, just because when I think of the 90s, one, obviously it's music is the first thing that comes to mind, and just that whole kind of grunge scene. I still remember hearing about Kurt Cobain's death, and the impact that had. And just, you have Nirvana, Pearl Jam, who's also represented in this list as well. But we had a whole new kind of genre of music that really was almost kind of invented and in the early 90s. And it kind of, unfortunately, there's not really grunge anymore. It's kind of been morphed into like alternative, I think. But for me, when you say the 90s, Nirvana is the first thing that stands out to me.
Okay, so for our roundtable questions, first one, what would you like to see as a theme for next year's March Madness tournament? Christy.
Yeah, I had a hard time thinking about something. I don't know if this has ever been considered, but like maybe like book series, just focusing on series, like so Game of Thrones, or even like kids series like Goosebumps, Geronimo Stilton or something. Yeah, that might be something that might be fun to do.
Cool. Meg?
Well, we joked at the beginning of the episode that I should pick a sci-fi book, and so no one will be surprised that my vote is for a sci-fi and fantasy bracket. I think there's so many books and movies and TV shows now, especially after Game of Thrones, that like you're getting a lot more of those sci-fi fantasy kinds of shows. And we could even replace music with video games and get that game category, that because there's a lot of great sci-fi and fantasy video games these days. So yeah, that would be my vote, because I think that it's such a broad range of things that I think we could have some really great discussions, and again, some really cool matchups from it.
Bryce?
Yeah, this has been on our list. I brought it up in our brainstorm, and we need to kind of figure out the details of it. But what I'd like to go with next year is heroes versus villains. So we can still have the 4 different categories, but in each one, it is like the hero of a series up against the villain of the series. So think of like Mario's up against Bowser in the first round, and then like Batman's up against the Joker, Dorothy, Wicked Witch. You got it. So then maybe, we'll let people decide which character they think should kind of move on. And we could get some fun matchups. Like you could have like Wicked Witch of the West versus Harry Potter in the next round, or that sort of thing. So I think we could have some fun with some of the matchups there. Caroline, how about you?
But the first one I thought of was, hey, we did the 90s, let's do the 80s. So we've got that one, or books to movies part 2, because there's lots of possibilities out there. So we've got some, I like these. We'll have to make a note in our spreadsheet for next year. Second roundtable question. What 90s fashion trend do you want to bring back in 2022, Christy?
I have 2. So in the 90s, I used to wear a lot of mood rings, which I think was actually a 70s thing that came back in the 90s. So I'd like to bring it back yet again. And then I never got to own a pair of Doc Martens in the 90s, and I would love to have a pair. So I'd love it if that fashion trend came back.
Nice. Meg?
Yeah, definitely Doc Martens should come back. My vote is for scrunchies. I just feel like, why did we stop doing that? They are delightful. You can have all the colors to match all your outfits. Like, let's bring back the scrunchie.
Nice. Bryce?
I think we've done a very similar question to this in the past, and I believe my answer was and still will be grunge. I think of the loose flannel. I'm a huge fan of flannel, by the way. In marketing, I tend to wear some flannel into the office every now and then, and I do get made fun of a little bit. So I'm still a 90s kid that way. But let's all start wearing really baggy jeans again and oversized flannel shirts. It was so comfortable. Caroline, how about you?
Windbreakers and warm-up jackets. I think that look, it's a little cold out there right now, but as we head into spring, perfect weather for that like jacket that'll crinkle when you put it on.
It kind of remind me, they're a little bit different, but for guys, I think pretty much every single one of my friends, or every male in junior high and high school, had a starter jacket. So with like, the pouch in the front where you put your wallet and your keys, and then there was like a team logo on the back. Junior high, I repped the San Jose Sharks on mine. Lots of teal being worn.
Meg, Christy, thank you both so much for joining us today. I've had a blast. This has been fantastic. I'm so excited about March Madness. Is there anything you'd like to plug for our listeners before we go?
So yeah, I was gonna say the virtual grand opening of the kitchen, March 19th and 20th is coming, and there's a lot of other kitchen and baking classes happening throughout March and into April. So please check our website for dates and times for those, because we're doing a lot of baking up a storm, and so you should definitely join us for both of those. Yeah.
And I should note too, those baking classes tend to fill up rather fast. So yeah, you can go to our events page, or else you can go to epl.ca/life skills. And there's a lot of times there's links there for them. So definitely keep your eye out for those there.
Yeah, and in March we're running 2 of the most popular ones from the past that we had sort of sold out. So there's a chance to get into the pretzels if you missed it first time around.
Christy, was there anything you wanted to let listeners know about?
Yes, just on behalf of the Early Literacy and Family Services team, we are looking forward to welcoming families back into our spaces for in-person programming soon. And they should just stay tuned to epl.ca for details on when that might be.
We'd love for our listeners to share their picks with us on social media. So you can download your own tournament bracket at epl.ca/podcast. You can then vote for your favorites every day on our website, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. So there's 4 places you can vote. So Seinfeld fans, got to represent. I'm worried about us in the first round. So make sure you share your bracket by using the hashtag EPL Overdue Finds.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you're subscribed so that you automatically get all of our new episodes. And you can also leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Please do. We love getting reviews. And if you like what you hear, please tell a friend about the show and challenge them to March Madness.
Yeah. And don't forget, we will have a giant list of everything that we talked about. There'll be a link to it in today's show notes. It'll have all 64 titles that are included in this year's tournament. And as always, we love to hear from you, our listeners. Email us at podcast@epl.ca or hit us up on Twitter by using the hashtag EPL Overdue Finds. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.